Hello, this is Anne Marie Vanderzanden, Professor of Horticulture at Iowa State University, and today's module that I'll be talking about is Sustainable Landscapes, Retrofitting Existing Landscapes. So this is the third module related to sustainable landscaping and really builds on what do you do if you have an existing landscape that you want to change to be a more sustainable landscape. In this presentation, I'll talk a little bit about those framing questions that you would use when you're deciding how you might be able to retrofit an existing landscape to increase the sustainability, and kind of the four categories that those questions fit into, including is the design still meeting the design intent? What could be done differently to the plant materials that are currently on the site? Are there different hardscape materials that could be used that would increase the sustainability? And then what might be done differently relative to the maintenance that's currently being done on the site as well? So probably the best place to start when you're looking at a landscape is to determine the answer to this question. Does the landscape still meet the initial design intent? That may be the best place to start because oftentimes what happens is as landscapes grow and change over time, as they're managed differently, as plant material maybe dies and is replaced with other plant material, things are going to change. And as a result of it, the landscape that's left may or may not still meet that desired intent. So specifically, what has changed? And the 3 points there that I've already kind of alluded to a little bit, the plants are probably the best place to start because they often change the most, mainly because they're a living entity and they may die or be damaged and need to be replaced. The other question to ask is, has the site user group been changed? So maybe originally the landscape was designed for somebody who had more time to do the maintenance. And over time, as they've aged, or maybe changed a job, or maybe lost interest in doing some of the maintenance, maybe they aren't able to do the type of landscape maintenance that the property requires. So the users themselves have changed a little bit. Or maybe there's other categories as well that have impacted how the design is currently being used and whether or not it's still meeting the intent. So those are kind of the framing questions to start with when you're thinking about whether or not certain changes could be made. In the next set of slides, I have some specific examples that we'll go through that can help you give a little bit more concrete things to consider. This is a really good example of a picture of a landscape that has evolved over time. One of the things that you can see is the plant material in the beds are quite mature. They're quite large. There's a small area of turf there that has a utility box and a fire hydrant in there, which makes it a little bit difficult to mow around. So as an example of a change that has happened relative to the plants, I would suggest that a way to make this area more sustainable would be to remove that turf grass and then add some of the additional ground cover that's in those beds. Bring it all the way out to the sidewalk, and then you're going to have less turf maintenance requirements. As the new ground cover gets established, it will fill in and you'll have less weeding and that type of thing that you'll need to worry about as well. So here's a specific example of one of those framing questions. So are plants serving their purpose in the landscape? So the image on the left, the broadleafed evergreens in the back, as well as the barberry, the red shrubs in the front, have been sheared over time to create kind of round balls and gumdrop shapes. And neither of those are a naturally occurring shape. As well, there's a lot of bare mulch area, which is going to have a lot of weed issues unless it's managed either by hand weeding or with chemical applications. The alternative on the right shows what that landscape could look like if the shrubs were allowed to grow to their normal and natural size and shape, And then if a ground cover was added in that area, so you didn't have to do as much hand weeding or chemical application to manage the weeds as well. So maybe I would argue that the landscape plants in that first picture on the left aren't still meeting the purpose of what that overall design intent was for the space. Another question to ask relative to the plants is whether or not they're vigorous and healthy. The image on the left shows very thin turf grass growing underneath a dense canopy of shade. Oftentimes, turf grass doesn't do well when it's growing in areas underneath shade trees because there just isn't enough sunlight that gets down there. As a result, you end up with thin turf. Doesn't look particularly good, and it opens it up to weeds infestation because the turf grass isn't healthy and thick enough to outcompete the weeds. The alternative on the right shows what it could look like if a ground cover was installed in that area. In the shadiest of areas, installing a shade-loving ground cover might be a viable alternative and could make the landscape more sustainable. I love this picture because it begs the question if whether or not lawns are being used in an appropriate location. From an aesthetic standpoint, if you enjoy the very modern look, then maybe this aesthetic works really well. But I would argue that it's going to be a little tricky to mow that lawn up on those stepped areas to the left-hand side of the image. An alternative that could give a similar aesthetic would be to use a low-growing, slow-growing ground cover that would fill in that area and wouldn't have to be maintained at the same level as the turf grass would. Another area to consider are some of the hardscapes. Now in this case we're not talking about what's on the ground like the pavers or something like that. We'll get to that in a moment. But in this case, we're talking about the lighting elements that are in the landscape. So the image on the left, you can see there's a tree trunk to the left, and then that white pole is actually a light for the property. You can't really see the light because it's kind of lost in the canopy of the tree, and so either the lighting contractor or the designer or somewhere during the installation phase somebody forgot that the tree was going to grow and as a result of it the light isn't working here. So a better alternative would be to remove that light into a different location so it's actually going to provide the lighting that you're asking for. The picture on the right is a great example. This is a commercial landscape as well. In this case, the lighting elements were put out in the turf grass area, which makes it very difficult to mow around. In fact, those light features there on the far right that are kind of spotlights pointing upwards have been damaged over the last 4 or 5 years and are probably going to have to be replaced because of the weed eating that a string trimmer that's been used in order to manage the turf grass around it. So a better alternative to make it more sustainable is if those would have been included in the planting beds. So the maintenance around them isn't as extensive as it is with them in the turf grass. One of the next things to consider are those hardscapes that are on the ground. And so, for example, in this case, can impervious surfaces be converted to a permeable surface? In one of the earlier presentations, I talked about the different kinds of permeable pavement options, and included in that were permeable pavers. And this is Buckingham Plaza in Chicago, Illinois. And they converted this area a number of years ago now, but to these permeable pavers, and it allows for the water to filtrate down through the paver area, and then they reduce the runoff from the site. You can see this is a huge plaza. It's a very large fountain area, and when there's significant rain events, there's quite a bit of water that's could be created on that surface that if it's not managed would run off either into the streets and possibly end up getting into a waterway that's nearby. So that kind of brings to this question of, are the hardscapes contributing to the runoff? So the parking lot on the left is a traditional parking configuration where you've got the asphalt. That's a lot of hardscape area that is going to have a lot of runoff. The image on the right is from the Morton Arboretum, and it shows a parking lot that has been retrofitted with permeable pavers. You can see those gaps between those individual pavers. The other thing I draw your attention to is the curb cut, kind of in the middle of the picture. And that's cut out, and if there is water that flows across, it goes into a rain garden, which is where those ornamental grasses are. So it's a combination of a permeable pavement system as well as a rain garden along the perimeter of the parking lot. So any potential water would end up being captured in the rain garden. From a homeowner's standpoint, there are alternatives to a concrete walkway. The image on the left shows a traditional type of a walkway that you might have. There will be some runoff from that because it's an impervious surface. On the right-hand side, you can see that these homeowners used stepping stones that are set at grade and just embedded right in the turf grass. So the water just goes right into that area and then just gets absorbed right into the lawn. Another example here of a little bit larger area. This is a driveway. The driveway on the left is fairly typical. Again, it's concrete, and there's going to be a significant amount of runoff when we have a heavy rain event. The picture on the right shows interlocking concrete that is filled with a sand type material and then planted with turf grass. So the water, when it falls onto that area, just goes right into the ground and then just moves in the regular groundwater movement rather than across the surface of the area, like what would happen on the left-hand side. So just an alternative if you're thinking about something more sustainable for a driveway type of material. One of the other ways to increase the sustainability is related to maintenance. So considering if odd-shaped lawns and awkward bed lines are impacting the maintenance. The picture on the left shows some odd-shaped turf areas that interfaces with a wall and then two different paving surfaces. It's a little bit tricky to mow that. It's going to take a little bit of time and probably use a string trimmer right along that wall area. On the other hand, the image on the right shows a swath of turf along the edge of that bed. It creates a natural buffer, so can also slow down any water runoff that may come from the bed and prevent it from getting down to the paved area. In addition to that, the shape of that turf is easy to mow, and the mower could go right along there and wouldn't have to be something that would be string trimmed afterwards as well. So reducing the maintenance and in turn enhancing the sustainability. Another question is related to the amount of bare area in a bed or the amount of mulched area that's not covered by plants. So does the landscape require excessive use of herbicides or hand weeding to manage the weeds? The image on the left has, although it is a young installation, it has a lot of mulch area that is susceptible to weeds getting established. So again, either chemical applications to control the weeds or a lot of hand weeding. The image on the right has been allowed to grow in and was planted in such a way that at maturity, the majority of the bed is covered with plant material. And in doing that, it is able to outcompete any weeds that might try to get established in there. So there's less hand weeding needed and less chemical weeding or chemical application needed. So the end result is a more sustainable maintenance approach for these beds. This example shows a newly installed or fairly newly installed landscape planting. And I'd like you to think for a few minutes about ways that it could be enhanced from a sustainability standpoint. Keeping in mind the amount of mulch that's bare mulch that's available or visible. and then even the shape of those shrubs, particularly those towards the front of the beds that are kind of that chartreuse color. So a couple of ways that the sustainability could be increased would be by adding additional plant material in the beds, as we've talked about in the previous slide. So you get a nice covering of plant material and less likely that weeds will be able to get established. And the other one are those chartreuse colored plants to allow them to grow into their natural habit and not, these have been rounded over a little bit and trimmed up in such a way that they don't really need to be. If they were allowed to grow in their natural habit, they still stay relatively short and compact, and so still would give a pretty good aesthetic for the landscape. Alternatively, this landscape has been planted in such a way that you can see there's just this great ecosystem of plant material that creates this network in the beds that it's going to be difficult for weeds to get established. Now, you might also argue that it may be overplanted, maybe there's a little too much in those beds. It could be thinned out a little bit. But I think the overall concept that I'm trying to show is that a more dense, more lush and full bed can reduce the amount of weeding maintenance and as a result make the landscape more sustainable. The image here shows a fairly new installation. I'd just like to point out a few issues with this particular design that are going to reduce the sustainability. The first are the rocks along the edge. You can see the turf grass comes right up to the edge of those, so that's going to be difficult to maintain and keep it a nice crisp edge. One way to work around that is to put in a kind of a barrier between the rocks and the bed and the turf that is kind of this zone where nothing or the turf grass doesn't come right up to it, so creating an edge along there will make the maintenance easier. Another concern in this design and looking at it is the row of evergreens that are adjacent to the driveway. Now, if this design is someplace other than the Northeast and the Midwest and kind of the Colorado, Utah area, it may not be a problem, but if it's in an area where they get significant snow, that could end up being an issue with snow being pushed onto that bed from the driveway and then ending up with either damage to those plants from the snow, or if the homeowners are using some type of ice melt material, that could end up getting into those beds as well and ultimately damaging the evergreens. So depending upon where the design is located, it's something that needs to be considered and whether or not it's going to meet the intent of the design. And this last image shows a landscape that at first glance is probably has a high maintenance component to it. You can see that the boxwood is sheared, the low growing kind of edging boxwood, and then those that have been rounded over. So from a maintenance standpoint, it's fairly high. Could be grown, it could be managed a little bit differently, not sheared as frequently. The plant material could be switched out, so instead of boxwood it could be some other type of a low growing, slow growing shrub. This still stays nice and compact. I would draw your attention to two things on the ground plane. The pavers, they are traditional brick pavers. And as you look at them, there's quite a bit of gaps in between. So just the way that they are installed makes them a little bit more sustainable because the water can move down through those gaps rather than having runoff. And then the other is the turf grass in that middle circle. Oftentimes we think of turf as being maintained in this beautiful, pristine way, but in reality, when you look at this one, you can see there's some broadleafed weeds that are in it. It's not a perfectly uniform green stand of turf, and there's some areas where it's even a little bit thin. So I think that that shows that that turf is not maintained with a lot of inputs, so probably is a more sustainable alternative than if it was a perfect lush stand of turf. So although at first glance the design does look like it's got a lot of maintenance and a lot of inputs, I would argue that it may not be as heavily maintained as we might think, and as a result, may be a little bit more sustainable than we even know. So that concludes this section on retrofitting an existing landscape for sustainability.